Welcome to the video. No. For today's video, we're going to be doing an in-depth tutorial on how to begin with Runpod. Now, obviously on this channel, a lot of the things I like to test are local, so I use my own systems to run things. However, in certain circumstances, and seemingly more often than not, there are models coming out that unfortunately are a bit larger than what enthusiasts would realistically have access to in their homes, and for that, I go ahead and just put things on Runpod and try them on the channel. For example, I did that with Grok 2, I've done it with some image generation models, and Runpod's something I've been using personally for a long time, and I have had a few folks reach out and actually ask me to make a tutorial on just how to set this up and actually be able to interact with it. So that's what we're going to be doing for today's video. Now, really, we're going to start from the ground up, where we'll basically go to runpod.io, which we have open right here on the screen. We will sign in, create all of the credentials and everything to be able to interact with our pod through SSH and actually deploy something that we can then go ahead and play with just using a regular web URL. So let's get right into it. So the first step here is obviously going to just be to go to runpod.io, which we can see is the address bar text that has been entered right here. So with that, I'm just going to run through the sign up process. Whoa, all right. So the mouse, obviously, that's kind of trippy, I suppose. All right. Regardless, let's go ahead and click sign in, which will just kind of give us the option to go ahead and sign in with an account. I am realizing now that this is probably far too small, so I'll zoom in. And for this, I'm just going to use a Google account that I have right here. So just to simplify things. Oh, okay. And we have to complete a human verification step, which... All right, and there's some questions and onboarding things you can skip if you want to. And we're going to choose an option for what we want to do. I think I just want to go ahead and use a GPU environment. So basically we will rent a pod which has one or many specific GPUs. And basically when we sign in, we're brought to the page right here, which is almost like a candy store, except it's GPUs of varying kind of potency and price and other statistics and things like that. So with that though, basically that's the sign up process. And the next step is going to be to put money into this, obviously, because it is a paid service. In the interest of keeping this as a full tutorial, I am also going to go through actually putting some form of credit into this. Now, truly to play with this, we're probably for today going to use a relatively cheap option because I want to actually demonstrate something that a lot of folks would be able to replicate down to the actual pod system that they're going to rent. So with that, I'm just going to toss a few bucks in here so I can actually go ahead and play with something that is somewhat realistic. Okay, so here's something, and again, this is a new account that I'm signing up with. I already have one, obviously, that I use for a lot of the demo stuff I do. I am seeing here, some of these are rather healthy numbers that are pre-put in right here. So the minimum credit account is 10, which I'm just going to go ahead and do, and I'm going to set auto pay to no. So just make sure you kind of pay attention to the numbers on the screen here when you actually go ahead and do this. But for this simple demonstration, I'm just going to go ahead and add this $10 into the account, which we can see. And this is obviously, again, a more in-depth and verbose tutorial, just kind of wanting to run up from the ground floor of even going to the website. All right. So cool. I now have 10 bucks right here. And basically that means that I am now free to go ahead and actually pick and deploy some of these GPUs. Now, something I would like to make note of is there are a few different ways to actually go ahead and use Runpod. And beyond that, let's say, for example, I was planning to click on this 5090 right here. They do actually have many different templates for different styles of things that folks may want to do. So if we scroll down right here, we can see there's a ton of different templates that would already have a lot of things pre-configured. So there's one for VLLM, there's one for Comfy UI, Runpod Stable Diffusion Comfy UI, Olama, Ubuntu Server, and truly there is just a ton of stuff right here. So we have a 111 Stable Diffusion, which you may be familiar with, and if I scroll down, you can see that the scroll bar, which is quite small, is just still like not even halfway right here. So there's a ton of different options that you can search for here for pre-configured templates in case you have something relatively straightforward that you want to do, such as like Comfy UI. But because I want this to be something that's a little more hands-on, we're not going to use any one of these pre-built templates for like Stable Diffusion or something. We're just going to pick a template for an actual just like default pod, which would be this one right here, which was already pre-selected for us when I did actually select this one specific 5090 system. Now, before we specifically select a pod to actually use for our setup and everything like that, I do want to make note that there are a few different options up here at the top where basically you can pick a CPU only pod or something like that if your use case necessitated just something like this. I imagine most folks would be more interested in the GPU pods. And then beyond that, you can choose between secure and community cloud. So basically community cloud I think would be best for maybe you're doing something that's not really sensitive. I just want to throw Stable Diffusion on a pod and be able to play with it, and I don't really care about like high-end like industrial level data security, then this could definitely be a good option. Beyond that, there is also of course the secure cloud, which you would have to kind of look into what the specific differentiation between the two is, but this is just kind of a little more secure in terms of like the actual location of these GPUs. And speaking of location, you can also specify specific regions to include. So let's say, for example, I only wanted something in North America, I could just kind of specify that and things like that. So then you can have like other different options here, really depending on your use case. You would pick something that is fitting of that. Now with this, I honestly think that I'm going to go ahead and I might just pop into the community cloud right here. And I think for what we're going to do today, I'm going to use an H100 PCIe. So this is an 80 gig VRAM card. It is, I think, previous generation now, but I oftentimes like to pick older cards because it's more likely going to be a smooth setup, I guess could be said. So with that, I now have this pod selected right here. And if I click on this, I should be able to scroll down right here and have a default template to choose right here, which we have. So I don't actually need to do anything, and it will come up with a name here. This is almost like how Reddit makes usernames, where it just will kind of give you a random string of different words. And I will do on demand. So spot means if someone else rents it, they will stop it. But on demand means you have it for the duration that you have it and nothing will interrupt it. So with that, I am going to now do a few modifications here pertaining to how we're going to access this pod. So first and foremost, I am going to disable the Jupyter Notebook. I'm not really a huge fan of that, but I do want SSH terminal access, but we can see right here that I am actually not allowed to click on that right now because I have not configured a public key for my system to be able to SSH to these pods. So that is the next step we're going to take. So in order to configure a public key, we're going to go to the settings pane, which we need to click on the arrow right here next to account, scroll all the way down and then click settings, where we will be brought to a few different options, mostly pertaining to authentication and things of that sort. So we can go ahead and I'm just going to minimize that right here. And I am going to click on the SSH public key section right here. And we're going to go ahead and basically just kind of do a few relatively simple steps, but we will need to have basic familiarity with the Ubuntu or Linux terminal for these steps. So Runpod actually has a lot of documentation on doing different things with their platform. Unfortunately, the specific one for actually doing what we want to do right now, it seems that some of the animated images are not currently loading. So this is one specific scenario where, one, I will tell them about this, so hopefully it'll be fixed by the time folks actually follow some of these steps. But two, this is one rare instance where the actual AI generated overview does give us the correct specific steps that we need to follow. So fortunately, we can just go ahead and actually do what is listed right here by the Google AI overview of things to do. So first and foremost, I am going to keep this on top so it does not disappear when I click into the browser. We're going to just run this command right here, which will do, as it says right here, generate an SSH key pair using the SSH keygen command. So that is what we're going to do right here in our terminal window, which, as I said, you'll need to kind of have a little bit of familiarity with the terminal, which I would assume you would have if you're interested in doing some of these things. Beyond that, we can just press enter right here to save it in the default location. Okay, and I'm not going to enter a passphrase, so this is not necessarily the most secure way, but there's really no need to actually do that for what we're doing right here. Our next step is to actually display the key right here. So we're going to run this command to just basically print it out for us so we can go ahead and basically take note of it. So we're going to go ahead and just copy everything right here. And once we've copied the key from where it was displayed right there, we're going to then go ahead and paste it right here into the SSH public key section that we had in our Runpod account settings. So I will just go ahead and do that and then click update public key. And we see our public key has been updated, so we can now go ahead and move forward in actually renting the pod. So now that the key has been saved, I'm just going to go back to the pod section right here where we can then go ahead and kind of pick up where we left off. So we were going to opt to use this H100 PCIe, and we have the default template right here, which just has some associated like graphics card drivers and things like that, which will come in handy for some of the things we want to run. Now, before we actually go ahead and just do all of this right here, first I should note that we now see that the SSH terminal access option is actually enabled, so we can go ahead and actually have that selected, which we want. But beyond that, I am going to actually, there are two buttons here. Well, there's three, but there's edit and then change template. So change template would bring us to this kind of giant page of specific pod templates, but the edit section right here is actually going to just give us some other things. So let's say that we're going to be downloading a relatively large image model or something like that. I'm probably just going to set both of these things to 200 gigabytes, and just so I have more space. I have run out of space before, and it's quite frustrating when that does happen. Beyond that, we can also select different ports that we want to actually expose, which will come in handy later when we actually run some of these things using a web UI. So I am also going to use 7860, which is the Gradio default web UI port, and then TCP is 22 right here. So this will just kind of allow us to SSH into the pod. So with that, we can now go ahead, and you do also have environment variables and things you can add in right here, but for the purpose of what we're doing, that's not necessarily pertinent right now. So I will set these overrides, and we see that the 4 overrides are selected and applied right there. And we can now go ahead and deploy this pod on demand, which brings us to a screen where we basically see that it is in progress in deploying it. It usually happens relatively quickly. Now, with Community Cloud, I'm not entirely sure what the specific networking speed of the pod is, but oftentimes when I'm downloading large AI models using Secure Cloud, they have very fast networking, so it doesn't take a lot of time to download things from Hugging Face or things of that sort. So now that our pod is set up and we can see that it's running right here, there are a few things to make note of. First and foremost, we can just ignore this Jupyter Lab thing right here. But when we actually go ahead and run the Gradio web UI that we're going to be using for this specific demo, it will actually report right here that it's ready, and that will just be helpful later on in the video when we want to actually access this from the overall like World Wide Web, which is cool. And beyond that, you can enable a web terminal here, which will just kind of allow you to interact with the pod just through the browser, which does simplify things, but for the purpose of being a more intricate and in-depth tutorial, I want to kind of just go ahead and do it through an SSH connection. So with that, we're just going to go ahead and copy this command right here for SSH. We're going to open a terminal window. Oh, I messed up right there. And then we're going to paste in the command that we just copied right here, and it will allow us to connect to our pod. So we can say yes, and then we will see the Runpod kind of in ASCII characters right here, and we are now connected to this pod that we just rented, and we can do something like NVIDIA-SMI, which will show us the actual GPU in the system, which of course is the H100 PCIe with a total of 81.5 gigabytes of video RAM. So with that, our next step is basically to go ahead and actually deploy something onto this pod so that we can then play with it and interact with it. Now that our pod is running and we are connected to it, the next thing to do is basically go ahead and actually use it to deploy something that necessitates a beefy GPU such as this. But before we get into that, I want to just make note of a couple of topics that may be of interest to folks who want to actually set something up that they can go back to later and actually use without needing to keep the pod running at full price for the entire duration of however long their project lasts. So from within the pod, or from within our terminal connected to the pod, if we type ls, we're going to see all of the files and folders in this root or home directory, but make note of in the far right, the workspace subdirectory right here. So the way Runpod is set up to work is every file, or basically anything we place in the workspace directory right here, will persist if we actually go ahead and stop the pod. So basically, instead of being charged $2 an hour to have this pod rented, say we're doing a project that's going to take 2 weeks. Instead of actually needing this to be running the entire 2 weeks, we can stop it, and anything we've placed or set up in that workspace directory, whether it's a model download, a Gradio script, or something like that, will actually stay there, though we'll be charged a much smaller fee for actually having the cloud storage or whatever staying on the pod. So anything outside of that workspace directory, when we click stop right here, will be terminated. So if you're using a pod just basically because you want to start and test one specific repository and get one sample output, you don't have to care as much about that. But if you're doing a longer term project where you want to have things that stay on the pod but not have to pay for it like hourly rate for the entire duration of the project, saving things from within the workspace directory and then being able to stop the pod and restart it at a later date is definitely the right way to go. So being that that is the case, at least for what we're doing today, let's just go into the workspace directory right here, and everything we do here, whether we download a model from Hugging Face or create a Python script for a web UI, will stay when we stop the pod. Now obviously if you want to just completely terminate the pod, you can stop it and then you can click terminate, which will go ahead and just wipe everything, and obviously you won't be charged anything for data storage once the pod has been terminated. But this is just something important to know that is Runpod ecosystem specific. Our next step is basically going to be to use the pod to actually run some form of model or whatever we're going to actually use it for. Now, obviously, this is something that is going to be very use case dependent. Anybody is going to have a variety of different reasons to need to use a pod or something like that. So being that that is the case, I want to just use something general here that I have played with before that I think is quite neat, but keeping in mind that this is just kind of a way to demonstrate how to set something up and then be able to access it after, with less emphasis on the actual specific thing we'll be running on the pod, which for today's purpose is going to be something called a step, which is a music generation model that I have tested many months ago. It feels like, even though it was probably like 4 or 5 months ago, which does feel like a long time with the speed of some of the developments. But regardless of that, this will kind of show us some cool things and just give us a good demonstration to actually set up our pod. So first and foremost, I am here in the GitHub repository for a step. And again, this is, you would be in the GitHub repository or whatever for whichever model you're actually choosing to use with the Runpod, and from within the workspace directory on the pod itself. I am essentially going to go ahead and actually follow some of the installation instructions here in this GitHub repository for a step. Now, somewhat commonly, the first step is going to be to clone this repository and then change directory into the clone folder, which will be done from within the workspace directory on our pod itself. And keep in mind, just as a refresher, everything being done in this terminal window right here is basically from this pod itself, which we are of course connected to. So our next step then is to create a virtual environment, and this is where I would like to take a second to show another kind of feature of something that is pertinent to know when using a Runpod or something of the sort. You're likely familiar with the concept of being told to use a virtual environment to install specific things, and this is no different, but there is a specific thing to make note of here. When we created this pod, we obviously chose a specific template, which in this case was the PyTorch one for CUDA 12.8 and PyTorch 2.8 and things of that sort. However, if we create a virtual environment here from within this cloned repository, we may need to actually go ahead and reinstall those dependencies, which this image already ships with, and that can not only use up valuable storage space, but it's just kind of an unnecessary step. So right now I have not gone ahead and created a virtual environment because I'd like to just give a more hands-on demonstration of what I'm referring to. So if I run this command right here, we are basically just going to be asking the system what specific dependencies it has right here. So we see that it has Torch version 2.8.0 with CUDA 12.8. And this is good because this refers to this kind of template that we chose when we set up our Runpod. If I was to just go ahead and actually follow the instructions right here to create this new virtual environment, if I were to run that same command again that we just ran, we would see that we don't have any of those packages installed. Now, obviously, we could then just go reinstall them from within this virtual environment, but because our pod template already has those, it's just much easier to go ahead and kind of create a virtual environment with those packages essentially in it already. So for that, I am going to just first and foremost deactivate this environment that was created right here and then remove it. If I can learn to type. And our next step is, instead of just doing something like this, we're going to add an additional flag in here so that our virtual environment will actually use the installed system dependencies from our pod template. So we're going to basically follow this in the same way, but we're going to add one specific flag to use the default packages of our pods template, or our pods, yeah, you know what I mean. So Python mbenv, and then our flag is going to be system site packages. And then we will, of course, name it. And this will just go ahead and tell this virtual environment to basically use the Torch installation and the CUDA 12.8, basically what we saw when we ran that command to test the system and ask it what specific software dependencies for the GPU and Torch it has installed. So if we now go ahead and activate that virtual environment that we just created, we can now go ahead and run this command once more, keeping in mind that we are in our newly created virtual environment, and we will see that it does properly have those dependencies installed from within it. So this is just a way to alleviate needing to go ahead and kind of reinstall things. But the important part of why we're doing it like this and in a virtual environment from within the workspace folder is, of course, because if we stop this pod, we want the environment setup and everything to be saved as well. So that way we don't need to go through these steps. So doing this in this fashion is the correct way to do it, assuming you're going to keep this pod around even on standby for your specific project. But now that everything like that is all set, we can just go ahead and continue with the A-step installation instructions. And again, this is something that is a little less pertinent to this actual Runpod tutorial, but you know. Now, while this is installing the dependencies for the program we're going to be using, I should also mention that you can click on the Telemetry tab right here, and you can go ahead and see more specific information about the actual utilization of your specific pod. So that is just, I suppose, cool to see, and something that would perhaps be pertinent for folks who want to use this for something that may be pretty heavy in terms of the utilization of the pod. So you can see how much storage you used, the uptime, GPU utilization, and things like that. So with that, oh cool. All right, so everything is now happily installed, and we can go ahead now and basically do the fun part of this, at least in my opinion, which is to go ahead and actually put this on the World Wide Web so that we can access it from running on our pod from even like a cell phone or something like that. Now, fortunately, the specific thing I've chosen to use here, which is, of course, the A-step music generation software or model, is actually really simple to use because it has a bundled web UI. So all we're going to do is paste this in, but you may recall that we specifically exposed the port 7860. So I am just going to slightly modify this command to expose or to run the web UI on 7860. And when we do that, assuming everything has been set up properly and is all good, it should first and foremost go ahead and so we're going to see I have made a slight misconfiguration error where basically this is showing it's running on localhost at that port, but because we don't have physical access to this pod, we're not going to be able to actually see it showing here or reflected as ready to be accessed from the wider web, if you will. So we're just going to click cancel on that. And in addition to the port flag, we're also going to add another flag that they have very kindly listed here. And this is why partially I like A-step, is because the documentation was very thorough. So we're also going to need to add the server name flag. And then if we do this now, and we press enter, once it shows that it will be running on the URL 0.0.0.0 at 7860, we can go back here into our pod and it should show here as ready. And just like that, we basically see that it is now shown as running there, but this has changed to ready. So now our next step is very exciting, basically to just click on this link right here, which will actually bring us to a URL that will show us this user interface for A-step. And this is running entirely on the pod that we just rented and set up and basically followed the GitHub instructions to get this running on it, which I personally find to be kind of cool because this is essentially accessible from anywhere. So again, the whole point of this video is not necessarily to play with this model, which is something I've already tested, but to show the actual steps leading us up to being able to deploy something like this and then access it from the web, from really any device that has internet access. So obviously I'll do something here so we can see things happening, but basically this is all running entirely on the pod that we just set up and interacted with. And we can see it just very quickly is now going ahead and generating the music. Obviously, this is an H100, which is a relatively quick card. So we can go ahead right here and then see. welcome to the video. No, so I may use that in the intro. But regardless, this is basically just kind of the culmination of all of the steps that we have run through up till now, where we're essentially able to access and play with this from the greater internet. And this is definitely good also for running things that perhaps you may not want to test out on your local network. There are obviously lots of security focused use cases for wanting to rent a virtual cloud system like this to be able to test and experiment with many different types of things that are out there. So I've now gone ahead and gone to this from a mobile phone, and basically we have our model running on this phone right here, which I really do hope that you can actually see. But basically we're able to rent an H100, run something on it, and then be able to use it or access it on our phone from anywhere, which I find is kind of pretty cool. So I'm just going to go ahead and generate something right here, and we'll see on the actual screen as well, it is going through the steps to generate audio. And this model is pretty cool because, well, especially on a card like this, it can generate audio in much faster than real time. So it basically would have just gone ahead and generated, let's see how much audio, 3 minutes and 46 seconds of audio in however long that took there. So that is really kind of cool. So that's kind of neat, I guess. So basically our next and final step is to just go through what happens next. Let's say that I just wanted to run this specific model on this pod and I don't care about using it again or having any of the setup or data saved on this. This step would basically be kind of similar to what we would do if we wanted this to actually be kept or retained. So first and foremost, we're just going to go back to the actual pod specific page right here. And let's just go ahead first and foremost and stop the pod, which will fairly immediately disconnect us from the actual SSH session we have with it, and we're given the actual idle disk cost. So let's say this is something I needed to have set up, but I was going away for a week and didn't really want to have to reset everything up when I came back. It would cost $1.33 per day for this to just keep all of the data and everything that was specifically in this workspace directory from on the pod. So let's say we go ahead and do that. Basically, at any time, we can now go back here into Runpod, and our pod will be listed right here, but obviously it will be stopped. So we can go ahead at any time and just click on it again and then restart it, which will go ahead and run it again. And all of our data in the workspace directory will be there, so we can then really go ahead and kind of jump back into this web UI at any point, which obviously is now terminated since we did stop the pod. On the other end of that, let's say, okay, I don't want to pay any money for the data that is staying on this pod because I just wanted to test that as a one and done thing. The thing we would do then is just go ahead and click the terminate button here, which basically, as it says right here, will remove the pod configuration as well as any non-network volumes and data associated with it. This is irreversible. Do you want to proceed? And I do. So we click terminate pod, and then our pod is done, and we can basically start where we had left off in the beginning of this video, where we can go ahead and rent any specific pod that we want. So really, that's going to conclude what is just kind of a tutorial on how to set up and play with or deploy a pod, with specific emphasis on using a default template that allows us to go find some random model or something like this on GitHub or Hugging Face or anything, and then deploy it on our pod and then use it from the World Wide Web as we saw in this video. So with that, I suppose that is going to conclude this tutorial video. I hope this was helpful. If you do have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments once you've subscribed. And thanks for watching.